A satellite photo taken after a Pacific storm rearranged the sand on a remote lagoon may have just captured the outline of a plane that vanished 89 years ago. And this October, a team is finally sailing out to find out if it's real. This is the actual current state of the search for Amelia Earhart's lost aircraft. And it's further along right now than it's ever been in nearly 9 decades of searching. For almost 90 years, Amelia Earhart's disappearance has been one of history's most stubborn mysteries. Was she lost at sea? Did she crash on some forgotten scrap of land in the middle of the Pacific? The world has speculated endlessly, chasing fragments of evidence, decades-old rumors, and grainy photographs that never quite added up to a clear answer. Now, researchers believe her Lockheed Electra may finally be within reach of being found, and an actual expedition is heading out this year to check. The renewed excitement centers on Nikumoro, a tiny remote atoll in the western Pacific, roughly halfway between Australia and Hawaii. Researchers have spent years studying something they call the Teria object, a strange shape sitting in the shallow lagoon that, in satellite and aerial imagery, looks a lot like it could be a downed aircraft, something resembling a fuselage and tail section rather than anything natural. The photo that first drew serious attention to it was taken in 2016 after a Pacific storm shifted the sand at the bottom of the lagoon and apparently exposed something that hadn't been visible before. What makes the object even more intriguing is that a similar shape appears to show up in aerial photographs from 1938, just a year after Earhart vanished. The images are grainy and black and white, and people have argued for decades over what they actually show. But modern image analysis has made the case that the outline lines up with the shape seen in recent satellite photos more convincingly than before. The object itself sits in a very specific spot, alongside a stretch of shoreline called the Teria Peninsula, which juts southwestward from the northern side of the lagoon, directly east of a channel called the Tataman Passage that connects the lagoon to the open ocean. Researchers have pointed to that positioning as one of the more suggestive details about the object, since it sits roughly where a damaged aircraft attempting an emergency approach from the ocean side might plausibly have come to rest. None of that positioning proves anything on its own, but it's part of why the object has remained a serious candidate worth investigating, rather than being dismissed outright the way plenty of other rumored crash sites around the Pacific have been over the decades. The team behind this renewed push is a partnership between the Archaeological Legacy Institute, led by Executive Director Richard Pettigrew, and Purdue University through the Purdue Research Foundation. Purdue's connection to Earhart isn't incidental either. Purdue helped fund the very Lockheed Electra 10E she flew on her attempt to circle the globe, originally as a kind of flying research laboratory, and Earhart had reportedly intended to return the plane to the university once the flight was complete. That history is part of why Purdue has stayed invested in this search for years, rather than treating it as a passing curiosity. The expedition has had a bumpy road just getting off the ground. It was originally scheduled to depart from Majuro in the Marshall Islands back in November of 2025, but in late October of that year, organizers announced the trip would be postponed into 2026 after running into additional clearance requirements from the government of Kiribati, which oversees Nikumoro, combined with the onset of the South Pacific cyclone season, making the timing too risky to push forward. Pettigrew was candid about the frustration at the time, saying the delay created real logistical and financial headaches for the team and its partners, but that they intended to push through it and stay the course. Steve Schultz, Purdue's senior vice president and general counsel, who is also part of the expedition team itself, described the extensive permitting process as requiring approval at multiple levels of the Kiribati government, calling the persistence required to keep the project moving forward a genuine example of Purdue's own institutional character. As of the most recent update, the plan has firmed up. The team is now set to depart this October, traveling out to Nikumoro to spend several days directly inspecting the Teria object before making the long trip back. Ahead of departure, expedition members even visited the Museum of Flight in Seattle to study a full-scale replica of the Lockheed Electra 10E, getting a close look at the exact type of aircraft they're hoping to find pieces of on the ocean floor. The team heading out this time is a genuinely varied group, not just archaeologists. Alongside Pettigrew, it includes Purdue alumna and field assistant Sarisha Bandla, ALI assistant Ren LaRocca, a medic named Aaron Arentz, maritime archaeologist Michael Crivor from Recon Offshore, filmmakers Helmut Schleppe and Tom Reiter, filmmaker Ella Van Cleve, and Steve Schultz, who serves as Purdue's senior vice president and general counsel, in addition to working as a field assistant on the expedition itself. That mix of archaeological expertise, maritime specialists, medical support, and documentary filmmakers reflects just how seriously this particular trip is being planned and recorded, compared to some of the more informal searches conducted over the decades. What sets this search apart from earlier attempts is exactly how methodical it is. Past expeditions to Nikumoro and other candidate sites sometimes relied on limited equipment, incomplete historical research, or educated guesswork about where wreckage might have ended up. This one leans on a much broader combination of tools: sonar mapping to scan the lagoon floor for shapes that wouldn't be visible from the surface, magnetometers to detect metal buried under sand or coral, underwater cameras and remotely operated vehicles to get close to fragile debris without disturbing it, and old-fashioned shoreline archaeology to check for anything that may have washed up over the decades. On top of the physical tools, the team has spent years cross-referencing historical aerial photographs, modeling ocean currents and tides to estimate where debris could plausibly have drifted, and studying weather records to understand how storms may have reshaped the lagoon over time. It's a genuine blend of old-school detective work and modern remote sensing, and that combination is a big part of why this particular attempt feels different from searches that came before it. It's worth being honest that not everyone in the field is convinced. Aviation historians and researchers who favor other theories about Earhart's disappearance have raised real skepticism about whether the existing evidence actually supports the idea that she and her navigator, Fred Noonan, ended up on Nikumoro at all, as opposed to going down somewhere else in the vast surrounding ocean. And there's recent precedent for caution here, too. In 2024, a separate search effort using an underwater drone captured sonar imagery that appeared, briefly, to show the unmistakable outline of an airplane resting on the Pacific seafloor. It generated real excitement online for a few days before a closer look revealed it was almost certainly just a natural rock formation that happened to resemble a fuselage from a distance. Pettigrew and his team are aware of that history, and their own public messaging around the Teria object has stayed fairly measured as a result. Pettigrew has described the object as something that clearly doesn't belong there naturally, calling it a man-made shape rather than a coincidence of sand and coral, and saying the visual appearance and specific location give real reason to think it could be wreckage from Earhart's Electra. But he and the rest of the team have also been upfront that the only way to actually know is to go there in person and look closely, which is exactly what October's trip is designed to do. Even the team's own project materials frame a negative result as a legitimate, useful outcome, not a failure, since ruling the Teria object out would still meaningfully narrow down where searchers should look next. Even before the team sets foot on the island, the renewed search has sparked worldwide curiosity. Picture it, a downed aircraft sitting largely untouched in a remote lagoon for nearly 9 decades, waiting to be examined by modern eyes for the first time. It's the kind of possibility that gets aviation historians and casual mystery fans buzzing in equal measure. People are already speculating about what might eventually be recovered: personal artifacts, physical pieces of the aircraft, or clues that could finally explain what happened during those final chaotic hours of the flight. To understand why this particular mystery still grips people almost 90 years later, it helps to remember who Amelia Earhart actually was, beyond just the pilot who disappeared. She was born in 1897 in Kansas, and from an early age, she showed the kind of restless curiosity and stubborn determination that would later define her entire career. She earned her pilot's license in 1923, and from there built one of the most decorated aviation careers of the era. In 1932, she became the first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean, and she went on to set records for speed, altitude, and distance throughout the following years. She wasn't only interested in flying for the thrill of it either. She wrote books, gave public lectures, and became a genuinely visible advocate for women in aviation at a time when the entire field was overwhelmingly dominated by men. She also spent time at Purdue University as a faculty member, where she mentored young women interested in aviation and navigation, a part of her career that tends to get overshadowed by her record-setting flights, but says a great deal about how she saw her own legacy. She wasn't chasing headlines purely for herself. She wanted to open doors for the people who would come after her. By most accounts from people who actually knew her, Earhart wasn't some larger-than-life, untouchable figure either. Friends and colleagues described her as playful and quick with a joke, someone with genuine warmth and an infectious kind of energy that made people want to follow her lead. At the same time, she had a reputation for being methodical and careful about her flights, rather than reckless, someone who studied weather patterns, fuel calculations, and mechanical details obsessively before ever taking off. That combination of daring and discipline is part of what made her so compelling to the public at the time. She wasn't a myth built entirely out of headlines. She was a real, specific person with genuine ambitions, real fears about the risks she was taking, and an insatiable curiosity about how far those risks could actually take her. That combination, genuine daring paired with a real sense of purpose, is part of why her disappearance hit the world as hard as it did. People weren't just unsettled by a missing aircraft. They were unsettled by the disappearance of someone who had seemed, up to that point, almost impossible to stop. The final flight began on July 2nd, 1937, as part of Earhart's attempt to circumnavigate the globe. She and navigator Fred Noonan had already covered thousands of miles by that point, pushing both themselves and the limits of 1930s aviation technology. Their next planned stop was Howland Island, an extremely small strip of land in the Pacific, barely large enough to support a runway, but essential for refueling before continuing the journey. As the day went on, things started to go wrong. Radio transmissions from Earhart grew increasingly fragmented and tense. She reported serious trouble locating the island, and communication problems compounded an already difficult situation. Unpredictable winds, strong ocean currents, and the limited navigational tools available at the time combined into exactly the kind of situation nobody wanted. When Earhart and Noonan failed to arrive at Howland as scheduled, the United States Navy and Coast Guard launched one of the largest search operations conducted up to that point in history, combing thousands of square miles of open ocean by air and by sea. Despite that massive effort, no wreckage and no definitive trace of the Electra was ever found. For a world that had watched Earhart become a genuine symbol of progress and daring, her disappearance felt both shocking and deeply strange, a celebrated public figure seemingly erased from the sky without explanation. Newspapers at the time ran headlines asking flatly where she had gone, and radio broadcasts carried every update from the official search alongside every rumor that happened to be circulating that week. People across the world speculated about what might have happened. Whether she'd crashed outright, managed to land somewhere unexpected, or run into some kind of foul play entirely unrelated to mechanical failure or bad weather. Fred Noonan's navigational skill had been considered nearly unmatched in the field at the time, which only deepened the confusion. If someone with his level of expertise couldn't get the flight safely to a target as small as Howland Island, many assumed the problem had to run deeper than simple human error, though investigators at the time were never able to pin down a single definitive cause. In the decades since, theories have multiplied endlessly. Some researchers and historians believe the plane simply ran out of fuel and went down in open ocean, sinking to a depth that may make it essentially unrecoverable with current technology. Others, including the team behind this current expedition, believe Earhart and Noonan actually managed to reach Nikumoro, then known as Gardner Island, landing on its reef, before eventually succumbing to the island's harsh conditions. That particular theory, often called the Nikumoro hypothesis, has been built up over decades by a research group called the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, based on a combination of radio-bearing analysis, later bone fragment studies, and various artifacts recovered from the island that some researchers argue are consistent with 1930s American manufacturing. Skeptics have pushed back on nearly every piece of that evidence at different points, which is exactly why an actual, direct, on-site inspection of the Teria object carries so much weight. It's one of the only ways left to move this specific piece of the puzzle from speculation into something closer to fact. So what would it actually mean if the team confirms, this October, that the Teria object really is wreckage from Earhart's Electra? Beyond the obvious headline moment, there's a lot the wreckage itself could potentially reveal. On the aviation side, the Electra wasn't an off-the-shelf aircraft. It had been custom-modified for long-distance flight, with extra fuel tanks, specialized navigation instruments, and additional communications equipment installed specifically for the round-the-world attempt. Studying the wreckage up close could give historians a clearer picture of how early long-distance aviation engineering actually worked, and how Earhart and her team adapted a standard airframe to survive a genuinely unprecedented flight plan. Details as small as instrument placement, wear patterns on the controls, or damage consistent with a rough landing could help reconstruct exactly how the final hours of the flight actually played out. Even a handful of surviving fragments, a bent metal panel, scraps of fabric, remnants from inside the cockpit, could offer real clues about whether the plane came down relatively intact or was seriously damaged before it stopped moving, and about what Earhart and Noonan might have done in the time immediately afterward, if they survived the landing at all. There's also a broader, almost archaeological value to a discovery like this, separate from anything specific to Earhart herself. Properly documenting, scanning, and analyzing wreckage that's sat untouched for nearly 9 decades is a genuine case study in how historians reconstruct distant events from physical evidence. Every fragment recovered and cataloged correctly adds another data point to a chain of evidence that's been debated and picked apart for generations. And there's a simpler, more human dimension to it too. A recovered compass casing, a piece of personal equipment, or even a single identifiable panel from the aircraft could turn what has functioned as legend for 89 years into something people can actually see and study directly, closing part of the gap between myth and confirmed history. There's a practical, forward-looking dimension to a confirmed find as well, one that goes beyond just satisfying decades of curiosity. If the wreckage can be properly documented and later recovered, it would give aviation museums and historians a rare, tangible artifact tied directly to one of the most significant flights of the 20th century, something that could be studied by engineers and historians for generations, rather than just written about secondhand. Purdue has already indicated that its long-term goal, if the site is confirmed, is a full archaeological excavation, followed by eventual display at a dedicated facility on campus, treating the aircraft less as a trophy and more as a piece of educational infrastructure that future students and researchers could study directly. That's a meaningfully different outcome than simply confirming a location and walking away, and it's part of why the team has been so deliberate about bringing proper archaeological expertise along for this trip, rather than treating it purely as a treasure hunt. Zooming out, the sheer persistence behind this search says almost as much about human curiosity as it does about Earhart herself. In the years immediately following her disappearance, the Navy and Coast Guard searches came up empty despite enormous effort, limited mainly by the technology and resources available in 1937. In the decades that followed, amateur historians, aviation enthusiasts, and curious researchers kept chipping away at the mystery, chasing leads that ranged from plausible to fairly speculative. Scattered physical clues, bits of metal, fragments of old radio equipment, pieces of period-appropriate shoes were repeatedly examined and debated without ever being conclusively tied back to Earhart's flight. Photographs from the 1930s showing odd shapes in shallow lagoons or along shorelines became the subject of endless amateur analysis. Some of it was dismissed as coincidence. Some of it kept the theory alive long enough for modern tools to eventually take a second, sharper look. Volunteers and academics alike sank years of their own time and money into these efforts, often chasing little more than a hunch and a stack of old photographs, traveling to remote islands and navigating genuinely treacherous waters for the chance to add even a small piece to a puzzle that might never fully come together. That kind of sustained, largely unpaid devotion is rare in almost any field, and it's a big part of why this particular mystery has stayed so alive in the public imagination for as long as it has, rather than fading the way most unsolved stories from the 1930s eventually do. That's really what changed the equation here. Sonar mapping, satellite imagery, and digital photo analysis gave modern researchers tools nobody searching in the decades right after 1937 could have dreamed of. Old grainy photographs can now be enhanced and cross-checked pixel by pixel against new satellite passes. Underwater terrain can be modeled and scanned in ways that used to require guesswork. Ocean currents can be simulated to estimate where drifting wreckage may have ended up over 80 plus years. That's the specific combination of tools that brought the Teria object into serious focus in the first place. An anomaly that likely would have gone completely unnoticed by earlier generations of searchers working with far more limited equipment. What's striking, watching this story unfold in real time in 2026, is how much genuine uncertainty is still built into it, and how honestly the people running this expedition are treating that uncertainty. Nobody involved is claiming victory before the team has actually laid eyes on the object in person. Pettigrew himself has said plainly that the only way to truly answer the question is to go to Nikumoro and inspect the Teria object firsthand, following the evidence wherever it actually leads, rather than assuming the answer in advance. If the inspection this October confirms it really is wreckage from the Electra, the plan is to return in 2027 for a full archaeological excavation, aiming to properly document, recover, and eventually put on permanent display whatever remains at a dedicated facility back at Purdue. If it turns out to be something else entirely, driftwood, coral formations, or debris from an unrelated wreck, the team says they'll treat that as a legitimate result too, one that at least rules out another possible resting place for the Electra and narrows the search a little further for whoever picks up the thread next. Either way, this October's trip represents the most serious, well-resourced attempt yet to answer a question that's outlasted nearly everyone who was alive when Earhart first went missing. Nearly 90 years after she vanished somewhere over the Pacific, technology, patient historical research, and no small amount of persistence may finally be closing in on an actual answer, one that could turn one of the 20th century's most enduring mysteries into a piece of confirmed history at last. It's worth sitting with just how unusual it is for a mystery this old to still have a genuinely live, testable lead attached to it at all. Most disappearances from the 1930s that were never solved at the time have simply stayed unsolved, with whatever physical evidence once existed long since scattered, decayed, or lost entirely to time and weather. Earhart's case is different largely because of exactly this kind of sustained, decades-long attention, generation after generation, of researchers refusing to let the question go quiet, each one adding a little more to the historical record even when their own individual leads didn't pan out. The Teria object is really the latest chapter in that much longer chain, not a single lucky discovery that came out of nowhere, but the product of nearly 90 years of accumulated maps, photographs, eyewitness accounts, and increasingly precise technology, all pointing researchers back toward the same remote lagoon. That's also why, whatever the team finds this October, the moment itself is worth paying attention to. If the object turns out to be the Electra, It would close one of the most famous open questions in 20th century history, and hand historians a genuinely rare physical connection to one of the era's most significant flights. If it turns out to be something else entirely, a rock formation, a different piece of debris, or simply an unusual trick of sand and coral, the search doesn't end there either. It narrows, the way real investigations tend to, ruling out one more possibility and refining exactly where the next expedition should look. Either outcome moves the story forward in a way that decades of speculation alone never could. For the first time in a long while, this isn't just another theory being argued about from a distance. It's a team on a boat, heading out to look for themselves. And by the time they return, one of history's longest-running mysteries may finally have a real answer attached to it.